when talk show host Miles Raymond mocked Trump's border policy on national television. He thought it'd get him laughs, not a showdown. But when Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, walked onto his stage, she didn't come to play. Armed with real facts, a steel spine, and a voice that wouldn't flinch, Karoline faced a liberal audience ready to boo and turned the night into something no one expected. What started as comedy turned into a clash of truth and pride. Stay with us. What happens next might just shake the ground beneath America's open borders. The lights in Studio 7 flared bright. Miles Raymond stood center stage of Talk Tonight, clutching the mic with practiced ease. For 2 decades, his sarcastic drawl had drawn millions of viewers, coastal, liberal, loyal. But tonight his voice carried something sharper than comedy. It carried a warning. Trump's wall, he declared, doesn't just block immigrants. It blocks America's heart. Laughter thundered from the studio audience. The line landed exactly how he wanted. He smirked, adjusted his tie, and leaned in. Let's call it what it is, folks. Separating families, fencing off hope, turning away children. Is that patriotism or cruelty wrapped in red, white, and blue? Applause again. But he wasn't finished. And here's the real question, he said, his tone now challenging. Will Trump's press puppet, that's right, Karoline Leavitt, dare to come on this stage and defend it? Will she stand here and explain how locking up toddlers makes America great again? The crowd oohed. A few chuckled nervously. But online it detonated like a firecracker. Within hours, the clip had racked up over 4.2 million views. On Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, the comment threads spiraled into digital war zones. #invite. Karoline began trending. So did #border cruelty and #wall of shame. Supporters of the wall fired back just as fiercely, flooding feeds with hashtags like #secure America and #finish the wall. Cable news jumped in. CNN ran the Karoline Raymond dares Trump's box, come defend cruelty live. Over at Fox News, the mood was red hot. Liberal late-night host attacks border security again. The country split right down the middle. Again. In retirement communities across Florida and Texas, viewers leaned forward in their recliners, eyes narrowing. They'd lived through decades of broken promises about border control, seen drugs flood into neighborhoods, watched politicians talk tough and do nothing. To them, Trump's wall wasn't cruelty. It was overdue common sense. But in coffee shops from Seattle to Brooklyn, younger crowds cheered Miles on. To them, the wall symbolized everything wrong with the current administration division, fear, isolationism. And at the center of the storm, one name kept flashing on screen, Karoline Leavitt. 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, and one of the most polarizing voices in modern politics. Loved by conservatives, loathed by progressives, and now, directly in the crosshairs of primetime television. The pressure on her mounted by the minute. Every pundit weighed in. She can't walk into that lion's den, said one anchor on MSNBC. She has to go. Backing down will look like fear, fired back a guest on Newsmax. By sundown, political commentators were openly gambling on whether she'd accept. She won't show, Raymond joked in a follow-up tweet. She's too busy reading Fox News talking points. If she comes, we'll have coloring books ready backstage. That one took it too far. Within minutes, thousands of conservative viewers flooded his post with American flag emojis, eagle memes, and clips of Karoline delivering fiery speeches at White House briefings. The debate wasn't just political anymore. It had become personal. And every viewer, every voter, every citizen was being pulled into it. Would she rise to the challenge? By the next morning, the talk shifted from if to when. Producers at Talk Tonight cleared a segment slot. Miles prepared his monologue, sharpening his jokes like knives. Graphics were queued up, the wall debate, compassion or chaos. The studio phones rang off the hook. And inside the West Wing, Karoline Leavitt watched it all unfold. On a muted television, the replay of Raymond's challenge looped again, his smug delivery, the laughter, the jab at her name. She didn't blink. Her fingers hovered over her phone. The entire country was waiting for her to flinch. She didn't. Instead, she leaned forward, clicked record, and spoke 8 words into the camera. Challenge accepted. I'll see you Thursday night, Miles. The video went live at 8:31 a.m. Eastern. By 9:00 a.m., it had hit 3 million views. Conservatives erupted in applause. Even critics couldn't look away. Something was about to happen, and they could all feel it. America had seen debates before, but not like this. Not with a 27-year-old conservative firebrand walking straight into the late-night lion's den, ready to defend the wall, the policy, the principle right in front of a hostile audience, and a man whose job was to make her stumble. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't stumbling. She was marching in. And now the countdown had begun. The West Wing was unusually quiet that morning. Karoline Leavitt stood by the tall window in her office, the TV across the room replaying the same clip for the 6th time. Miles Raymond's challenge rang out again, smirking, taunting, echoing through the speakers like a dare the entire country had overheard. Her phone vibrated in her hand, but she didn't look at it. Instead, her grip tightened, knuckles, whitening jaw set. No emotion showed on her face, but inside, the fire was already burning. Across the room, her communications director, Jake Mendoza, stepped in, holding a folder, his expression grim. "Karoline, don't," he said, voice low but firm. "That show is a setup. Miles isn't interested in policy. He wants a punching bag with lipstick." He placed the folder on the desk, then looked her square in the eye. "His audience isn't ours. They'll laugh before you even speak." She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her eyes stayed on the TV. Jake pushed again, more urgently. "He'll cut you off, mock you, twist your words. Let Newsmax or Fox handle the response. Don't give him the stage." From behind him, another voice chimed in, Sarah Rhodes, her deputy press advisor, tablet in hand. "Karoline, we're tracking comments online. They're already calling you Trump's mouthpiece, afraid to speak. If you don't go, they'll use your silence like a confession." At that, Karoline turned. "No," she said, voice sharp, deliberate. "If I stay silent, they win by default. They'll say Trump's America can't defend itself. They'll define the story." Jake shook his head. "But it's a trap." Karoline nodded once. "Then I'll walk into the trap and break it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah slowly smiled just a little. "You'll need numbers. Real ones." "I have them," Karoline said. She walked to the cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a manila folder, thick with printouts. Steel production rates, fentanyl trafficking arrests, construction job growth, wage increases in border towns, statistics with dates, sources, impact summaries. It was all there because she'd been preparing for this kind of fight long before Miles Raymond ever called her out. As she slid the folder into her briefcase, Jake exhaled. "Okay, if we're doing this, we go all in." An hour later, the plan was in motion. The White House media team scrambled to prepare. Outlets were notified. Her social media team polished a simple message: "I'm not afraid to defend America. See you Thursday night, Miles." It went live at 11:43 a.m. and immediately surged to the top of X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Within 30 minutes, Nanshta, Karoline. Answers was trending nationwide. By early afternoon, the atmosphere in the communications office had shifted from hesitation to readiness. Karoline changed into her red blazer, the same one she'd worn at her first White House press briefing. For her, it wasn't just a color. It was armor. Jake ran through talking points while Sarah coordinated with production staff from Talk Tonight. There were strict guidelines in place, no pre-edits, no time cuts, no planted questions. Karoline had insisted, "I don't want favors. I want their raw format. Let America see everything." By 5:30 p.m., the SUV was waiting. She exited through the West Wing side entrance. A light breeze caught the edges of her notes, but she held them firm. Reporters shouted questions from beyond the press barricade. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just got into the vehicle, eyes forward. The motorcade rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue past rows of brick buildings, monuments, and flagpoles still fluttering from the morning's half-staff tribute. In the car, Jake sat beside her, tapping nervously at his phone. "They just booked a Harvard economist to be part of the panel," he said. Karoline didn't look up. "Good. Let him come." Jake glanced sideways. "You know they're going to compare you to him. Academic versus press secretary. Degrees versus guts." She closed the folder on her lap and looked out the window. Guts built this country. Academics just write about it afterward. Silence followed. Traffic slowed near the Potomac and the driver switched to the express lane. Karoline stared straight ahead. The tension in the car was thick, but her pulse didn't jump. She wasn't nervous. She was focused. Because in her mind, she wasn't just walking into a studio. She was walking into enemy territory with the flag on her back, and every person who believed in that flag watching from home. Older veterans from Georgia. Retired factory workers from Ohio. Farmers in Iowa. Grandparents in Arizona whose kids were raising their children alone because of the opioid crisis. These weren't just statistics on a page. These were the people the media laughed at until Karoline stepped on screen and reminded them they still mattered. Jake cleared his throat. 5 minutes. The car pulled up to the back entrance of Studio A. A stagehand opened the door, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Leavitt, right this way." The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, cluttered with cables and camera rigs. The air smelled of studio lights and old carpet. Karoline walked briskly, heels clicking, red blazer a streak of color against the black walls. They reached the green room. A producer met her at the door. "Miles is warming up his opening monologue. You'll be introduced after the break. You'll have 2 main segments plus time for rebuttals. Oh, and we'll have 2 expert guests joining the discussion." "Fine," Karoline said, scanning the stage map. The producer hesitated. "One of them is Dr. Harold Lynn." Jake groaned quietly. "Of course." Karoline didn't react. "Let him bring charts. I'll bring truth." The lights dimmed on the main stage. The crowd's buzz was building. Karoline stood near the side curtain, just out of view. Her mic was clipped, notes in hand, heart steady. From the stage, Miles Raymond's voice echoed into the wings. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "yes. Trump's press secretary is here tonight, and she says she's not afraid." The crowd erupted, applause, laughter, and a few groans mixed together. Karoline could hear it clearly. Every voice, every doubt, every sneer. Jake whispered from behind, "You ready?" She didn't turn. "I was born ready." The stage lights surged to full, the music flared, and Karoline Leavitt stepped into the fire. The music cut. The applause flared. The curtain opened. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage of Talk Tonight, her red blazer catching the spotlight like a torch cutting through smoke. The crowd wasn't gentle cheers mixed with boos, claps drowned by groans, the kind of welcome designed to rattle. But she didn't blink. Her expression was steady, her pace even, and every step forward said, "I'm not here to win your applause. I'm here to defend my country." Miles Raymond stood center stage, mic in hand, face already wearing that trademark grin, the kind that says, "This is my turf." The crowd fed off his energy, leaning in for the punchline they knew was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miles said, drawing out the moment, "please welcome the wall defender in red." Laughter erupted. Someone in the back whistled. Someone else shouted, Where's the compassion? Miles basked in it, gesturing dramatically as if he'd just introduced a villain on Broadway. Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped right to her mark and met his smirk with something colder than steel. "You build laughs," she said, voice firm and controlled. "I protect lives." A few scattered claps emerged from the conservative side of the audience. The rest stayed quiet, caught off guard by her speed. She wasn't here to play defense. Miles chuckled, trying to steer the tone back to comedy. "Well, I'm glad you showed up, Karoline. I expected you to be busy signing deportation orders or hanging do not enter signs on baby formula cans." More laughter. Cameras panned to the audience, many leaning back, arms folded, grinning, expecting another roast session. Karoline turned toward him. "Is that what this is to you?" "A joke?" she asked. "You laugh while women are trafficked across open borders. You mock while fentanyl kills Americans every single day. Is that funny to you?" Silence. Brief, but sharp. Miles shifted. "I think compassion matters, Karoline. Separating children from their mothers isn't American." She nodded once. "Then where was your compassion when 150,000 women and children were trafficked into this country last year through the same compassionate open border you cheer for?" That hit differently. A few people in the crowd started murmuring. The laughter stalled. Miles blinked but recovered fast. "Look," he said, "no one supports human trafficking. But your administration's policies are hurting families. You think putting up walls and cages solves anything?" Karoline took a single step forward, holding her notes at her side. "Yes, it does. Because a nation without borders isn't a nation, it's a landing pad for crime, for drugs, for chaos. Walls don't separate families. Cartels do. And this administration isn't turning away families, we're turning away exploitation." A loud cheer burst from the right side of the audience. Flags waved. A man in a veteran's cap shouted, "She's right." Miles lifted his hand to quiet the crowd, trying to steer it back. "So, let me get this straight. You're defending separating children from their parents at the border." Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'm defending America's right to protect itself. And let's be clear, those separations, they happened when adults brought in children who weren't theirs. They lied to get through. We protected those kids from being trafficked, not punished them. But you don't mention that, because it doesn't fit the punchline." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some clapped, some booed. Miles squinted slightly, realizing this wasn't going to be a simple roast. He went in again. "You talk about protecting Americans, but don't American values include empathy? Kindness? Isn't that part of who we are?" Karoline's eyes narrowed. "Empathy without security is chaos. Kindness without truth is weakness. We are a generous nation. We take in nearly 1 million legal immigrants every year. But there's a difference between a door and a floodgate. One welcomes, the other overwhelms." A ripple of applause rolled across the conservative side of the room. Even a few undecided faces in the middle began to nod. Miles, feeling the shift, tried another angle. "Okay, Karoline, let's talk numbers. You say this policy protects Americans, but what about the cost? We've seen spikes in detention center expenses, lawsuits, international criticism. Is that your idea of strength?" Karoline raised her voice, just slightly steady but commanding. "You want to talk costs? How about $35 billion in annual expenses tied to illegal drug trafficking? Or the 71,000 fentanyl deaths in 1 year alone? Or the billions spent in ERs treating overdose victims who never should have had access to those drugs in the first place?" A few gasps. Then silence. Then a wave of applause, louder than before. Miles opened his mouth, but paused. The rhythm had shifted. Karoline wasn't on the defense anymore. She stepped closer, not too much, just enough to own the space. "You treat this like it's about feelings," she said. "But this is about facts. Americans are dying. Our working class is being crushed. Our border agents are overwhelmed. And while you joke about red blazers, my team's working overtime to save lives and restore order. Who's really leading with compassion here?" The camera panned slowly to Miles. His grin had faded, replaced by the faint tension of someone realizing the battle wasn't going as expected. He turned back to the audience. "Well, folks, she's fiery, I'll give her that. Stick around because we're not done yet. We've got some experts backstage ready to weigh in." The music played as the show cut to commercial. Karoline stepped back unshaken. Miles leaned over, his voice low. "You came in swinging." Karoline replied just as quietly, "I came to tell the truth. Swinging's just a bonus." He smiled again, but this time it wasn't cocky. It was cautious. Backstage producers were already scrambling. Viewers at home were glued to their screens. And across the country, retirees in quiet neighborhoods and factory towns, farmers and small business owners watched with wide eyes and full hearts. Someone was finally saying what they believed on a stage where no one thought she could. Karoline had come to defend Trump's border policy. Instead, she'd redefined the entire conversation. And the night had only just begun. The commercial break ended, but the tension hadn't. If anything, the studio felt tighter now, heavier. The crowd buzzed, not with laughter, but with something else. Suspense. Miles Raymond returned to center stage, his trademark grin back in place, but dulled at the edges. His opening shots had landed, but Karoline Leavitt hadn't flinched. In fact, she'd landed punches of her own. Still, he wasn't done. Not yet. "Welcome back to Talk Tonight," Miles said, gesturing wide. Before the break, Karoline Leavitt gave us her version of border reality. But now we're bringing in the facts. He turned toward the wings, his voice lifted. "Please welcome our guest expert tonight, Professor Lena Park, human rights scholar from the University of Michigan, and author of Borders and Broken Homes." A round of applause surged from the left side of the audience. Lena Park walked onto the stage with a calm, poised presence, dressed in a dark blazer and sensible flats. She carried a thin folder under one arm, her expression steady and composed. Miles gave her the spotlight immediately. "Professor, he said you've studied this issue inside and out. What's really going on at the border?" Lena stepped forward, adjusted her mic, and launched straight into it. Child separations rose by 40% during the Trump administration. She said, her voice clear and measured. "That's not national security. That's trauma. That's not patriotism. It's cruelty, hiding behind a flag." The audience gasped. One side applauded. The other shifted uncomfortably. Karoline stood motionless, waiting for the noise to die down. She turned to Lena, her tone as cold as the steel she'd cited earlier. "And fentanyl deaths from open borders. That's trauma too. Where's your outrage then?" A hush swept through the room. Professor Park didn't miss a beat. "Ms. Leavitt, I agree fentanyl is a crisis. But there are other ways to fight drugs than traumatizing children. Your administration separated infants from their mothers." Karoline's voice cut clean through the air. "Because we had to. You don't stop trafficking by asking politely. You stop it by enforcing the law. Some of those so-called mothers weren't even related to the children. Cartels use kids as shields, and we don't apologize for protecting them." The crowd responded with a mix of shocked murmurs and rising applause from the conservative side. Miles stepped in, trying to steer. "But Karoline, 40% is a huge number. These are children scared alone, locked in holding facilities. And where were they before Karoline shot back? With strangers paid by cartels to walk them across the desert in stash houses sold into sex rings. You want to point fingers at detention centers, fine, but don't ignore the fact that open borders are a magnet for predators. That's not compassion. That's negligence." The line landed hard. Professor Park took a step forward, her tone rising slightly. "Ms. Leavitt, the United Nations condemned your border policy. International law recognizes asylum seekers. You're criminalizing desperation." Karoline didn't blink. "I'm prioritizing Americans. This administration doesn't answer to the UN. We answer to the people who pay taxes, follow the law, and expect the government to keep them safe. If someone wants to seek asylum, they can do it the right way at a legal port of entry. That's the law." Half the audience clapped. The other half sat stiffly, arms crossed. Professor Park turned toward the crowd. "Separating kids causes psychological damage that can last a lifetime. These aren't numbers. These are children. And so are the kids in Ohio overdosing on fentanyl smuggled through the same border you want to leave open." Karoline shot back. "They're not headlines to me. They're real families, real funerals." A woman in the audience covered her mouth. A man near the front shouted, "She's right." Miles jumped in again, voice light but forced. "Let's keep it civil. Professor Karoline, this isn't Congress. No one's yielding time." Lena Park stepped back slightly, her voice cooling. "I'm not suggesting no border. But humane enforcement matters. Detaining toddlers in cages. That's not who we are." Karoline looked straight at her. "You know what else isn't who we are? Letting our law enforcement officers die in ambushes at the Rio Grande. Letting 14-year-old girls disappear into cartel pipelines. You call it cruelty. I call it control. Because when we lose control, we lose the country." The line sparked another wave of applause, this time stronger than before. Chants of "Karoline, Karoline" echoed from the back rows, even as others hissed or groaned in protest. Miles tried to cool the tension. "Okay, folks, clearly we've got some heat in the room. Let's take a breath." But there was no calming it now. The studio had become a microcosm of the country split straight down the middle. Red and blue. Order and emotion. Truth and belief. The conversation had left television. It was personal now. Karoline glanced toward Miles. "You invited me here expecting a soundbite. But I came with truth. And if that truth is uncomfortable, maybe it's because it challenges the fantasy you've been selling." Professor Park, lips tight, adjusted her notes. "We'll see how that truth holds up under data." Karoline's reply was swift. "I am data. You just don't like what it says." As the stage manager waved the break signal, the cameras faded to black, but not before capturing one last image: Karoline, standing, tall, crowd in full uproar, while Professor Park stood across from her, shaking her head quietly, reloading for the next round. Backstage, Miles removed his earpiece and glanced toward his producer. "She's tougher than they warned us." Producer nodded. "And she's not done yet." Neither was the night. The battle over truth, trauma, and the border had only just begun, and America was still watching. As the stage lights returned from break, the audience settled back into their seats, but the calm was only on the surface. What had begun as late-night political theater had evolved into something else entirely. Karoline Leavitt had held her ground against Miles Raymond's opening jabs, and then parried every emotional strike from Professor Lena Park. But now came the next challenge, less emotional, more clinical. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miles announced, turning toward the wings with dramatic flair, "please welcome our second expert tonight, renowned economist from Harvard University, Dr. Harold Lynn." Applause swelled from the progressive side of the audience as Dr. Lynn entered. Tall, silver-haired, and wearing a conservative gray suit, he carried a stack of documents tucked under one arm, and the air of someone who trusted numbers more than words. He offered a polite nod to Karoline, then adjusted his glasses before stepping to the mic. "Thank you, Miles," he began calmly. "Let's shift this conversation from sentiment to substance." Karoline didn't move. She already knew the playbook. Dr. Lynn continued. "Under the Trump-era border policies, strict enforcement and trade slowdowns cost the U.S. economy billions. Manufacturing delays disrupted supply chains, increased tariffs on cross-border goods, all contributed to a drag on our GDP. That's not theory, it's data. He turned to the audience, then glanced at his notes. In 2020 alone, American GDP dropped by $112 billion due to trade interruptions at southern ports of entry. American farmers lost overseas buyers. Small businesses paid more for imports. That's not security. That's economic self-sabotage. The studio grew quiet. Karoline waited until he finished, then took a single step forward. A strong border, she said, builds strong industry. We saw a 12% drop in unemployment among construction workers when illegal labor was cut off. That's not sabotage, that's stability. That's GDP in action. Murmurs rippled across the room. Some nodded, others frowned. The clash between economic theory and on-the-ground impact had begun. Dr. Lin smiled politely, clearly prepared. That 12% gain, Ms. Leavitt, was offset by higher material costs across the board. Concrete, lumber, imported tools all saw price hikes. The housing market tightened. Small businesses lost access to reliable seasonal labor. The economy can't run on slogans. It runs on balance. Karoline didn't blink. The economy also doesn't run on fentanyl funerals. Let's talk balance. Try explaining to the families in West Virginia or New Hampshire why it's okay to flood the country with drugs because it makes avocados cheaper. That line hit hard. Miles jumped in, trying to steer the moment back toward levity. Sure, if patriotism means paying $3.79 for an avocado, that's a high price for red, white, and green. The audience laughed nervously this time. But Karoline didn't flinch. She turned to him, voice sharp. Better to pay more for fruit than to pay for the funeral of a 15-year-old who overdosed on pills laced with fentanyl, trafficked through a porous border. You want to talk cost? That's the cost we've been ignoring for years. Applause exploded from the conservative side of the audience. A man near the front stood up and clapped alone until others joined in. It was no longer just a discussion. It was a battleground. Dr. Lin held his ground. Ms. Leavitt, fentanyl isn't only coming through illegal crossings. Most of it moves through legal ports hidden in cargo trucks' containers. A wall doesn't solve that. It creates bottlenecks, not breakthroughs. Karoline nodded. Which is why we need more agents, more scanners, and stronger deterrence, not less. But while we're building that capacity, border enforcement has to be tough. If you make it harder to smuggle, fewer smugglers try. That's deterrence. That's common sense. Miles raised his hand slightly. What about the humanitarian side? Karoline, isn't there a line where economics and empathy meet? She looked straight at him. Absolutely. And that line is law and order. Without it, everything collapses. You can't help those in need when you can't even protect your own people. You want compassion. Start by securing the country. Dr. Lin stepped forward again. But long-term economic damage matters too. Investment slows when uncertainty grows. If small businesses can't predict shipping costs, if farmers lose export markets, we all suffer. That affects pensions, retirement accounts. Your audience understands that. Karoline turned to the crowd. And they also understand what happens when crime floods their neighborhoods, when jobs are undercut by illegal labor, when schools are overwhelmed, hospitals overcrowded, and emergency rooms can't function. Security isn't anti-economy, it's the foundation of it. There was no applause that time, just silence. The crowd was thinking, processing, reevaluating. Dr. Lin tried one final time. The data is what it is. Border enforcement taken too far hurts the economy. That's historical fact. Karoline shot back instantly. And surrendering sovereignty hurts the soul of a nation. That's historical fact too. Miles glanced between them, the usual glint in his eye replaced by something more serious. He knew this segment had gone far beyond punchlines and applause lines. "We're going to break," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. As the cameras began to fade, Karoline looked toward Dr. Lin, not with disdain, but with resolve. "I respect your numbers, Doctor. But numbers don't bury loved ones. People do. And protecting them is worth more than a few points on a spreadsheet." The music played, the lights dimmed, but no one in the studio moved. Backstage producers whispered, phones buzzed. Online, the comment sections lit up. Karoline V's Harvard trended within minutes. Cable news stations cut into their regular programming with the Karoline Leavitt fires back at Harvard. Economist border debate ignites viewers. Across U.S. and across America, living rooms, retirement communities, VFW halls, and kitchen tables, viewers sat riveted, because someone had finally brought the kitchen table truth to a stage long ruled by sound bites. Karoline Leavitt wasn't quoting theories, she was defending the front porch, and this fight was far from over. The studio had become a battlefield. Karoline Leavitt had just stood her ground against a Harvard economist and a human rights professor, and the crowd was no longer simply watching, they were part of it. One side clapped furiously, the other jeered with equal intensity. Tension crackled like static between the rows. In the back corner, chants began to rise, low at first, then louder. "Karoline, Karoline." It was no longer a polite television debate. It was a national moment unfolding live, raw, and unscripted. Miles Raymond, ever the showman, tried to seize back control. He raised his mic, flashed his signature grin, and tossed out one last jab, light but loaded. "Thanks for the data dump, Karoline," he said, his tone wrapped in mock sincerity. "But tell us, can America really afford border patriotism?" Laughter sputtered from his side of the crowd, but it couldn't compete with what came next. Karoline stepped forward, closer to him than she had all night. Her voice didn't rise in volume, but in strength, every word landing like a drumbeat. "You joke," she said, eyes locked on his. "I protect. That's why America knows who to trust." That was the line that cracked the studio in half. Applause exploded from the conservative corners, spilling forward, met by loud boos from the opposite end. Some audience members rose to their feet. Others folded their arms, clearly furious. The stage manager signaled to cut to credits, but the room was still echoing with the aftermath. The moderator's closing words were drowned out by the roar of the divided crowd. The lights dimmed. The cameras stopped rolling. But the story was just beginning. Within minutes, Fox News released their headline banner across the evening primetime slot: "Karoline destroys Miles on his own stage." Bold, sharp, and unapologetic. MSNBC, in full counterpunch mode, put up theirs just as fast. Leavitt loud but empty. No human solution, just rhetoric. Online, the hashtag border battle surged to the #1 trending spot on Twitter. Viewers at home began posting split-screen reactions, memes of Karoline slapping down economists, screenshots of Miles's stunned expression, and side-by-side video clips of her fiery closing line, "I protect. That's why America knows who to trust." It was replayed over and over again, captioned, subtitled, re-uploaded with music, and dissected by influencers, analysts, and even comedians. On Facebook, veteran groups, suburban moms, and retired officers shared clips with captions like, "Finally someone with guts. Karoline speaks for real Americans. I may not agree with everything, but she stood firm when it counted." But on progressive feeds, the reaction was just as strong and just as bitter. She avoided every moral point, cold, callous, and dangerous. A masterclass in deflection. Karoline's name trended across every platform within 30 minutes. Talk Tonight's YouTube channel uploaded the full debate under the title "Karoline Leavitt versus the Experts." Full, unedited showdown. It crossed 2.5 million views by midnight. And while the country debated, her phone buzzed silently in her hand backstage. She glanced at the screen. A text message. Just one line, "You made America proud again. DJT." She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained cold, focused, not celebratory. She handed the phone to her aide without saying a word, then pulled off her mic and jacket, folding it neatly. Miles walked past her in the hallway, nodding once, respectful. Now, no grin, no sarcasm. "You surprised me tonight," he muttered. Karoline nodded back, not breaking stride. "That won't be the last time." Outside, a crowd had formed by the studio doors, supporters waving flags, chanting her name. A few protesters shouted angrily, holding signs reading, "Walls divide, compassion unites." She passed them all without reaction, flanked by security, stepping into the SUV without a word. The windows rolled up, the world muffled, but not silent. Inside the vehicle, her communications director, Jake Mendoza, handed her a tablet. "Fox News is looping your closing line," he said. "They're calling it your Reagan moment." Karoline didn't look up. "And MSNBC?" she asked flatly. Jake shrugged. "Called you dangerous. But the clips everywhere. Even CNN's debating whether you turned the tide." She leaned back against the headrest, eyes focused on nothing for a second. Then slowly, she spoke. "This war's not over." Her tone was clear, not angry, not boastful. Strategic. The kind of voice you hear from someone who didn't show up to win a debate, but to launch a campaign. The SUV moved through the streets of Manhattan, lights reflecting off the tinted windows as the city buzzed, unaware of just how much had shifted inside that studio. Back at the network, producers replayed the tape in slow motion, analyzing reactions. The moment she turned to Miles, the flash in her eyes, the line delivery, Miles' brief pause, the crowd's eruption. It had all the makings of something more than a headline. It was a cultural fault line, and Karoline had stepped right into it with confidence, facts, and zero apology. Across America, especially in the homes of the 65-plus generation, the reaction was powerful. They saw a young woman standing in enemy territory, refusing to back down, quoting real numbers, confronting real fears, and daring a hostile crowd to shout her down. And when they couldn't, when she outpaced the host, the professor, and the economist, they saw something rare. They saw conviction. And in a world drowning in noise, they knew the difference. In a world where noise often drowns out truth, what we saw tonight was something rare. A young woman who stood her ground, spoke with conviction, and reminded America that strength doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing firm when it matters most. For those of us who've lived through decades of change, through wars, recessions, and cultural divides, we know one thing: real leadership doesn't always sound polite. Sometimes it sounds like courage. Whether you agree with Karoline or not, her willingness to walk into a room where she wasn't welcome and speak for the voiceless, that means something. It's a reminder to all of us, especially in our golden years, that the fight for this country's values never really ends. It just passes to the next generation. And maybe, just maybe, we've found someone willing to carry that torch. If this message meant something to you, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. We tell the stories the mainstream won't. Drop a comment below. Were you inspired, frustrated, proud, surprised? Your voice matters here, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, God bless America.